Yeah. Yep.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages, as we say when we start our monthly story swap, welcome to the South Sound Story Guild monthly story swap. And we always start off with a couple of fantastic tellers, and then from there we proceed to a story swap. And we have some more fantastic tellers, some mediocre tellers, but we're all slightly above average. So, and any kind of story goes. I'll just let you know that right off the bat. And we do talk about some other things too, like money and what else we're doing. So we always start with an opening or a featured teller, opening teller or a featured teller. So the opening teller tonight is Barbara Fankauser. And if you got Tobey's newsletter, you're able to read a lot about her. And I was trying to memorize all of it, but I know that she's from the Portland Storytellers Guild. And the other thing I noticed was she likes to tell elder stories. Now, what she's telling tonight, I don't know, but we're going to get a surprise. So Barbara, welcome to the South Sound Story Guild's January Story Swap. And thank you for participating.
So I just, hang on a second. Okay, I wanted, I don't know, I have a picture of a microphone on my screen, so I'm not sure if I can change that or not. But hang on a second. Okay, so I'm telling you a story from Southeast, kind of Central Asia.
One other thing too, we got to tell everybody, we are recording these stories, by the way. Okay?
Okay, so the name of this story is Anarchist and the Black Bearded Bai. There was once a young girl actually, who lived with her father, a woodcutter, and they lived in a ramshackle cottage at the edge of a forest. Now, the only tool they had was a gap-tooth saw, and the only transportation they had was kind of a broken down white horse and an aging donkey. But you know, as they say, the rich people's fortunes are in their herds. Poor people's fortune are in their children. And every time the woodcutter looked at his daughter, Anarchis, all of his troubles fell away. And Anarchis, she was only 9 years old at the time, but she was wise beyond her years. And people from all ages and from all around would come to her asking for her advice. Now, one day, the woodcutter, her father, loaded up the horse with wood to take to market to sell. And he said to his daughter, Anarchis, if I sell everything, I will buy you a treat. And Anarchis said, well, that would be very nice, Father, but remember, one man's fortune is another man's loss, so take care. Well, her father led the horse off, and they got to the market, and he stood there in the market with the horse loaded with wood, and he waited, and he looked, and people just kept passing him by all day. Apparently, no one needed wood that day. And so as the afternoon wore on, a rich black bearded Bai arrived in the marketplace. Oh, he was dressed in beautiful silk robes, and he looked around and he saw the woodcutter, and a sly look came across him, and he went up to the man and he said, "Excuse me, how much for the wood on that horse?" And the woodcutter said, "Well, 1 talon." And he said, "And will you sell it exactly as is?" Well, the didn't know quite what that meant, but he said, "Well, certainly, sir." And the Bai said, "Then fine, follow me home." And so the woodcutter followed the Bai home to his fabulous house, and they got there, and the woodcutter began to unload the horse, and the Bai said, no, you sold it to me exactly as is, and since the wood is attached to the horse is now mine. Well, the woodcutter began to argue, and the Bai said, "If you don't like it, we will go to the judge and he can decide." So they went to the judge. And as the wise people say, just as a bad trainer can destroy a good horse and turn it into a nag, so a bad judge can turn a right into a wrong. Well, the judge, he listened to the Bai's argument, and he looked at the Bai's fine robes and his sleek oiled beard, and he listened to the woodcutter and his tattered robes. And when he was done, he looked at the woodcutter and said, "Well, you should not have made such a bad deal. Indeed, the Bai bought as is, including the horse." Well, the woodcutter didn't have any recourse, so he went on home, and he told Anarchis what had happened, and she didn't seem terribly concerned about it. She said, "Never mind, Father. In the morning, I will take wood to the market and see if I do any better." Well, in the morning, he loaded up the donkey with the wood, and she took the donkey and they went to the market, and the two of them stood there and waited. And again, no one seemed to need wood, and they waited most of the day. And finally, that same Bai with his beautiful robes and his lush black beard came in, and he saw Anakis there, the little 9-year-old girl next to the donkey with all the wood. And he went up and he said, "So tell me, little girl, how much is the wood on that donkey?" And she said, 2 talents. And he said, "And will you sell it as is?" And she says, "Certainly, sir. And will you pay as is?" And he said, "Well, certainly." And he held out his hand with the 2 talents in it. And she said, "Fine." And so she followed him back to his house and got there. And as she started to unload the donkey, he said, No. I bought as is. That includes the donkey." She said, "Very well." And so he handed her the money, and she said, "Fine, I've taken the money, but I want the arm to go with it because you sold it as is. You agreed to pay as is." And he said, "Well, that's ridiculous. My arm, and I'm giving you my arm." And she said, "That was the agreement." So they went back to the same judge, and the judge listened to the 2 arguments from the Bai and from Anakis. But you know that the day before, the judge had set precedent. And so he looked at the Bai and said, I'm sorry, but she is correct. You did agree, and so you must compensate her for your arm. So the Bai was fined another 50 talents to pay for the wood with the donkey. Well, he was furious. He was sorry that he had met her and had bought the wood and bought the horse and bought the donkey, but what could he say? And he paid the 50 talent and the 2 for the wood that he'd agreed. And he said, "But, a sparrow cannot outdo a hawk. So I challenge you. I will put up 500 talents against your 50 to see who can tell the biggest lie." Well, Anarchist, she said, "Done." And so the Bai looked at the judge, and he kind of had a little smile on his face. And this is the story he told. "Before I was born, I found 3 ears of corn in my pocket. I threw them out the window, and the next morning they had grown into a field of corn so vast and so dense, it took one rider 10 days to get from one side to the other. And it was so dense that 40 of my best goats jumped into that field, and they disappeared. I searched and searched, but I could never find those 40 goats. Well, at the end of the summer, we harvested the corn, and we ground the corn into flour, and we baked the flour into bread. And when I took a roll out of the oven, it was steaming hot and pillowy, and I bit into that delicious roll. And what do you think? Out of my mouth jumped a goat, followed by another goat, and all 40 of my goats came out, and they were all as fat and sleek as a 4-year-old bullock." And he looked at the judge, pleased with his lie. Well, the judge's mouth was hanging open at such a whopper. Anarchist did not turn a hair. She said, "I am not as learned and as knowledgeable as you, so I do not have the kinds of rich stories that you have, but pray listen to my humble tale. A number of years ago, I had a seed for a cotton plant. I planted it in my garden. In the morning, when I woke up, that plant had sprouted and grown up to the clouds. It was so tall, it threw a shadow out across the sands that would take 3 days to cross to get to the end of that shadow. Well, when the cotton was ripe, I harvested it and I cleaned it and I sold it. And I bought enough, I had enough money from the sale of that cotton to buy 40 camels and load each of those camels with great bolts of beautiful silk. And I asked my brother to please take it to Samarkand and sell. And he agreed. And the day he left, he was wearing his beautiful silk robes, and he led my camels off towards Samarkand. And I did not hear another word about him for all these years. But just recently, word came to me that he had been killed by a rich Bai with a thick black beard. And I had no way of knowing who or how to find that Bai that killed my brother and stole my camels until now, because you, Bai, are wearing the robe that my brother wore when he left town with my caravan. Well, the judge and the Bai, their smiles fell away. They were horrified. The judge thought, what am I going to, if I say this was a lie, then the Bai will owe her 500 talents. And if I say it's the truth, then he will be It will be even worse for him because he will be having to compensate for her brother and her camels and her silk. But he did not have to decide because the bai broke into a huge shout. He said, "You lie, you lie. That is the best lie I've ever heard." Oh, well, there he was. He had to pay the 500 talents along with the 50 and the 2 for the wood. He said, "I am sorry that I ever met you, little girl, and take your talents and take this robe. I never want to see it again either." And he stormed off. Well, Anarchist, she took the coins, she counted them out carefully, rolled them up in the silk robe and put it under her arm, and she walked back home. Her father, now it was late when she got home. Her father was worried. He was standing in the doorway. He saw her coming, and he was kind enough not to say anything about the fact that she didn't have the donkey with her anymore. He said, "Oh, come in, come in. I can tell that rich bai, that hard-hearted bai has swindled you like he swindled me." And she said, "Oh, no, father, I got a good price for my wood." He said, "Well, what did you get?" And she handed him the silk robe. He looked, he said, "Well, it's a very nice silk robe, but without our horse and our donkey, we will starve to death very soon, and this robe will not help us a bit." And she said, No, I got a good price for the wood." And she took the robe and she flung it out, and the gold talons showered down on the floor of their little hut, and her father was stunned. And then she told him the adventures she had had that day with the judge and the bai, and how they'd come to have so much wealth. Well, her father laughed and her father cried, and at the end, she said, "Father, while the rich keep their fortunes, the poor keep their cunning. What is in a young girl's head is far better than what is in a rich man's purse." Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a wonderful story. So try to remember that one, because occasionally we do tell tall tales around here. Did you have another story you wanted to tell tonight?
No, I thought that was my time limit. So
Okay, there you go. Well, we don't set a time limit, but think about it. Maybe you want to tell another one later.
hey,
But thank you very much.
welcome.
Okay, our next featured teller now is Ingrid Nixon. And again, if you read her bio, you'll read that she has a master's in storytelling, is told at the National Storytelling Festival, got a CV as long as my right or left arm. She's got a radio program up in Hope, Alaska, which is at the end of the road. And I think the thing I always remember about Ingrid is one story she told, and that was about mowing grass at the first lawn she and her husband ever had. So that'll be a story you'll have to ask her about sometime. But tonight, Ingrid is going to be our featured storyteller. So welcome, Ingrid. And again, we're just reminding everybody, when you tell stories, they are recorded and we can send them back to you later. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It is really nice to be here. And Barb, that was wonderful. That was really, really a wonderful story to set the stage for tonight. So I have 3 stories for you tonight. And when I was looking for how these stories went together, what seemed to join them was the whole idea that there are parallel worlds. Parallel worlds. And they all seem to have a bit of a northern flair. So they take place in the upper reaches of the planet. But this first story tonight comes to you. I am coming to you from Alaska, from Anchor Point, Alaska. And so I was thinking about my travels in the northern reaches, and I was thinking about Iceland. And I know that there are some of you in the audience who have been to Iceland. And when you are in Iceland, like if you are in Reykjavik, the capital, and you're driving down this modern road, the road will all of a sudden come to a rocky outcropping or maybe a divot in the landscape, and it will suddenly jog around that and just keep going. And in the United States, you just go ahead and pull out that rock and pave right over it and things. But if you ask the locals why they made a point to go around that rock, they will tell you because in that rock, there are elves. So there is that sincere belief in elves. And thus, with that in mind, I discovered this story when I was in Iceland. Now, long ago, in a very small village, there was a custom that at the end of the day, after you had been working in the barn or working in the fields or working in your store, everybody would come home and then they would lie down and they would take a little nap. And they would sleep until it became dark. And then it was the job of the magistrate's wife to go around and wake up everybody in the village. She seemed to have a knack of just waking up at just the right time, and she didn't mind going around and giving everybody a little bit of a wake. And then everybody would light their fire and they would light their lamps. And perhaps the whole reason for this custom was so that they could save fuel. Well, there was this one night when everybody came in from their work and they all laid down to take a nap, including the magistrate's wife. And she slept and she slept and she slept and she didn't wake up. She just kept sleeping. And the night got later and later, and pretty soon people started waking up of their own accord. And then the magistrate woke up and he looked over and he saw his wife was still sleeping. But it seemed like she was sleeping so peacefully that he decided to just let her sleep. And so then it was finally pretty late in the night where she woke up and she was, and she realized what time it was. And she said, "Husband, I have had the strangest dream." And so she proceeded to tell her husband, the magistrate, about her dream. And in her dream, she had been lying down taking her nap, and she had had her shawl wrapped around her shoulder per usual, and she became aware of this soft knocking at the door. And then the door opened, and in stepped a small man. And she was kind of opening her eyes, and she saw this small man, and she knew right away he was an elf. Now, she had never seen an elf before. Nobody had ever seen an elf before, but he, by his tiny stature, he was indeed an elf. Well, the man came to her and said, can you please come and help me? Come, come, come." And so, of course, she got up out of bed. She made her way across the room, pulled her shawl a little close around her shoulders as she stepped outside. And then they made their way through the town. Everybody was asleep. And they made their way through the field. And at last they came to this big rock. Now, she had seen this rock pretty much every day of her adult life. But this time, the elf man said to her, "Stand still." And then he proceeded to walk around that rock 3 times clockwise. And when he finished the 3rd circuit, that rock transformed into a beautiful small elf house. And that small elf man, he walked to the door and he motioned for her to come, but that door was so small. But as she walked toward the elf house, she proceeded to shrink. And so by the time she got to the door, she could fit through the door just perfectly. And so she stepped into that elf house, and what she became aware of almost immediately was this, and she looked over, and on a bunk next to the wall, there was an old woman sleeping who would occasionally let out this big snore. But even more, in the middle of the room, there was a very pregnant woman. And this woman was in labor and she was distressed. And that's when the elf man said, "Can you help? We need the help of a human here." Now, the magistrate's wife was not a midwife, but she had helped deliver a couple of children. And so she worked with the elf man to boil some water and to get some towels. And in time, she helped that young elf woman give birth to this beautiful baby. And she washed the baby and wrapped the baby in a soft cloth and then handed the baby over to the new mother. And the new mother held the child and looked down in the child's eyes. And the child just looked around. And that's when the elf mother said, "Oh, here." She handed the baby back, and then she reached over and took a little bottle of ointment. And she said, "You must put a dab of this ointment into each of the baby's eyes." So the magistrate's wife took the child and turned and put it down on a table, and she took that little pot of ointment, and she had never heard that you had to put an ointment in the baby's eyes, but she took a little dab of it on her finger, and she just touched it into the child's eyes, and then as her back was to the elf mother and father, she took a little dab and she put it in just her right eye. It stung and her eye began to water, but she wiped away her eye until her eye felt pretty normal. And then she picked up the child, turned around, handed the baby back to the elf mother. And this time, when the elf mother held the child and looked down into the child's eyes, the baby looked up at the mother's eyes. And then the mother and father looked at the magistrate's wife and said, "Oh, we are so grateful. Here." And they gave her this gift of this beautiful woven cloth. It was just this exquisite fabric that the magistrate's wife had never seen anything woven that finely. And she took it and she put it around her neck and then wrapped her shawl over it. And then the elf man said, "I will take you home now." And he led her out the door. Now, just as she was at the door, the new mother said, Wait. Can you offer any words that will help guide this child in his life?" Well, the magistrate's wife, she had no idea what to say. And so she thought of church, and she said, "May your child always find comfort in Jesus Christ." And the moment she said Jesus Christ, the old woman in the bunk there next to the wall suddenly went and she sat up and she had such a surly look on her face. And she got up and she went and got a broom and began to sweep the floor very deliberately, as if she was trying to sweep the words of Jesus Christ out of that room. Well, the elf man seemed a little embarrassed by this, but he told the magistrate's wife, come with me. And the magistrate's wife, she stepped out of that elf house. And as she walked away from that house, she began to grow back in stature. And then the elf man said, "Stand still." And he walked around that elf house 3 times, counterclockwise. And by the time he had made the 3rd circuit, that house had turned back into a rock. And he led the magistrate's wife across the field and through the town and back to her door. He thanked her, and then he turned and left. Well, this is when the magistrate's wife said, "Wasn't that just such a strange dream?" And the magistrate said, wait, what is that under your shawl?" And she moved her shawl, and underneath her shawl was that beautiful piece of fabric. Oh, this was so strange. Well, by now it was very, very late in the evening, so the 2 of them went to bed. But the next day, when the magistrate's wife got up and she stepped outside to go to the market, all of a sudden the world was so different. Not only did she see the people of the village going about their usual business, but she also saw elves. There were elves walking down the main street, and whereas the humans were maybe moving some cattle past the barn out into the field, there were elves moving some sheep right alongside them. And when she looked out in the field, she could see that men were plowing and elves were plowing. There were elves everywhere. And when she said to the first human, she said, Where did all these elves come from?" And the person looked at her. Was she touched? I mean, she had slept very late the night before. Was there something wrong with the magistrate's wife? Well, the magistrate's wife was suddenly embarrassed. It was obvious that this person did not see the elves. And then she realized that she could only see the elves from her right eye. If she closed her right eye, the elves were gone. Well, since no one else could see the elves, she became used to the fact that she was the only one that could see that these 2 worlds were really intertwined. But there was this one day when she was in the store, and she could see there were elves shopping and taking things off the shelves, and she saw this figure of a woman that was standing at the counter. And when the woman turned around, she recognized that it was the elf woman who had given birth to the child. It was a new mother. And she rushed up to her and said, "Oh, it is so lovely to see you here. You are looking wonderful. How is the baby?" And the elf mother got such a look of anger on her face. She knew exactly what she had done with that ointment, that she and spat into the magistrate's wife's eye. And when she finally wiped that elf saliva out of her eye, no surprise, she could no longer see any elves. And so it was she lived the rest of her days, knowing that there were two worlds, but one of the worlds was just beyond her sight. So that was a story from Iceland. Now, this next tale comes to us from Alaska, from the Copper River region. And the people who live there are Dene. They are a part of the Athabascan group of Native people. And this story was collected by a man by the name of John Smelcher, who is a member of the Copper River tribe. And what he says in his collection of stories is that the number of people in his tribe is dwindling, and that please tell these stories, because when his people are gone, these stories will be gone too. So that's what I take as permission to share this story. Now, the people lived off the land, and they spent all summer preparing for winter. They would be fishing, they would be hunting. They wanted to make sure they had a lot of meat, a lot of fat, a lot of berries. And so it was in the summer that this young man, he was walking through the forest looking for berries, and he came across a little mouse. A little gray mouse had a big fish egg in its mouth. And this little mouse was struggling to get up over a log. And the young man smiled, and he reached down and he just picked up that little mouse, gave it a little boost over the log, and the little mouse jumped to the other side and then scurrying off with that big fish egg in its mouth. Well, fall was very brief, and winter came with a fierceness, and the people had not had enough time to put away enough food. And they realized that the food would not last the winter, and they realized that even as they cut back on their rations, that in the end, some of them would starve, some of them would die. And so it was in the middle of winter that that young man was out and about. He was hunting. He was looking for any type of food. And he came into an opening in the forest, and there was this tiny little house. It was a tiny little house with smoke coming up out of the chimney. And he walked up and he took a look at this house. And it was then that he heard a voice. He had no idea where it came from. But the voice said, "If you close your eyes and you turn around 3 times, you may enter the house." So that's what he did. And by the time he had done it 3 times, he was so tiny, and he walked into that house. And there was a man standing there wearing a gray fur coat. And the man said, "Oh, I know you are so hungry. Sit down, let me give you a meal." And so the young man sat at the table, and all of a sudden he had this big pile of food. There was meat, there was fat, there was berries, and he ate it all. And then the man said, "I know your people are starving. I know that they are suffering, and so I would like to help." And he took a knapsack and he put it on the table between them. And he said, "Take this to your people. It will help." And the young man said, "Well, thank you." And he took the knapsack and he stepped outside that tiny house. I mean, it was a really tiny house. But with every step he took away from that house, he grew up in stature, except that little knapsack did not. That little knapsack was just tiny. And so he said to the small man who was standing at the doorway, "This will not feed my people." And the man said, "Oh, my son, you must remember, it was in the summer months. I was struggling to get home with food to feed my family. And now I am giving you enough food to feed yours. When you get home, take that small knapsack and leave it outside overnight. And in the morning, all will be well." So when the young man got back to his village, sure enough, he left that small little knapsack outside. And in the morning, when he went outside, it had grown to be of good size. And when he opened it up, they pulled out meat, and they pulled out dried fish, and they pulled out fat, and they pulled out berries, and they pulled out more meat and more fish and more fat and more berries. They pulled out much more than could ever fit in that knapsack. And all winter they continued to pull out more and more food, and so it was that all the people survived. And so that young man and all the people in the village had gratitude for that tiny little man who had once been a mouse. And they were grateful to the young man because he had saved his village, because at one point he had showed mercy to a small animal. But I must say, I love that idea in that story of it has such an Aesop fable quality about it, about the lion and the mouse Aesop fable. But also that whole idea that, something so tiny, that there's another universe that the animals live in that's parallel with ours, if only we are open to it. So now this last story comes to you. It reflects my heritage. Now, these days I live in Alaska. I live in a pretty small place in Alaska. I rarely get stuck in traffic. But when I do go to the big city and I do get stuck in traffic, I seek ways to entertain myself. So, I people watch and, admire people's cars, but I love to read bumper stickers. Now, you can read a lot. You can learn a lot about people from their bumper stickers, like, the makeup of their family, if they're dog people or cat people. You can certainly learn about their political leanings, but you can also learn about their sense of humor. And there was one bumper sticker that I've always loved, and it says, "When lutefisk is outlawed, only outlaws will have lutefisk." Yeah, so for the uninitiated, lutefisk is one of those traditional dishes that is associated with the Nordic countries. And like most traditional dishes, it sounds, pretty reasonable until you really learn what goes into making it. And a lot of traditional dinners are like that. Like the Scots and their haggis. It's like you put what in a sheep's stomach? What? Or the Germanic countries and their blood sausages or head cheese. I mean, head cheese. Or up in Iceland, they love putrefied shark, which is exactly as described, putrefied shark. So lutefisk is codfish that is marinated. It's what it's marinated in. It is marinated in a lye solution. Now, granted, it is a weak lye solution, but it is lye, like what you use to clean your drains. And lutefisk actually means lye fish. Now, I spent my formative years in Minnesota. So, with Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, all the Nordic population in that neck of the woods, lutefisk was not something that was unheard of, but it was unheard of in my family's house until one night. I must have been about 7 years old. I remember sitting at the dining room table, my father, my two brothers, there was this light shining over us, and my mother put before us a lutefisk dinner. And it was served the way lutefisk should be served, which is this white fish is covered with a white cream sauce. It's got white potatoes. It's got green peas, and the whole thing is swimming in butter. Now, my brothers and I, we look at each other. Our mother, she was not a foodie. She was not an adventuresome cook. She was like a hamburger and potatoes type of cook. Tuna fish casserole. If we were lucky, we got fish sticks. Score. So here we get this lutefisk. My brothers and I were exchanging glances. Now, my parents, they were card-carrying members of the Clean Plate Club, which meant we did not serve ourselves, but we could not leave the table until our plates were empty, no matter how long it took. It was like my parents were like, we got all night. And sometimes that's what it took. Well, my brothers and I were looking at this lutefisk. We pick up our forks and we touch the fish, which is cooked to perfection, which is to say, it is gelatinous. My appetite vanishes utterly. I realize that my lutefisk is not going anywhere, and either am I. I feel like I am going to probably be celebrating some birthdays there at the dining room table. Maybe there will be a wedding, maybe some funerals. I mean, maybe ice ages are going to come and go, and I am still going to be sitting at the table with that lutefisk on my plate. And I look at my mom. Didn't she love me? Now, it would be many years before I came to understand what lutefisk meant for my mother. And since we're not too far removed from Christmas, I'm going to share this portion of that story because my mother grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She grew up in a Finnish American community. Her people had come over from the old country to get that better life in America. So the men, they were working in the mines. The men and the women, they were working on farms. And in my mom's family, her father, when she was a young girl, he got a brain tumor. And that effectively took him out of the family for many years until eventually it took his life. So my mom's mom was, for all intents and purposes, a single mom. And she had 4 kids to raise, 3 girls, 1 boy. But Finns, they have this special quality called sisu. It is this combination of grit and determination and stick-to-itiveness, this sisu, and my mom's mom had it. So she was determined that she was going to keep this family together and the family going. But the world, the States just come out of the Great Depression. War was heating up in Europe. My mom's family did not have a lot. So it was this very memorable day, a couple weeks before Christmas, when this crate arrived on the steps at my mom's house. Now, there was no return label. There was nothing that said where this crate had come from, but it was definitely addressed to them. They took the lid off, and inside there was this dry, ropey codfish. Now, it was gray and sort of curled up on itself. It looked like dry, gray bed sheets. But when my mom and her siblings and her mother looked at that, they saw something totally different. They saw Christmas dinner, but a transformation was required. So, in a carefully timed process that started about a week before Christmas, my mom's mom pulled out this big wooden tub and a wooden paddle. And she put several gallons of water in that wooden tub. And then for every gallon of water she put a tablespoon of lye. And she used that paddle to stir it around. And when it was ready, it was time to submerge the fish. So she took that dry, stiff codfish and submerged it in the water, just pressing it down. It didn't want to go down. And it seemed like if you pressed on this side, this side would pop up. And if you pressed over here, this side would pop up. But she kept working it with that paddle, trying to get the fish to submerge. And eventually it relented a little bit. And then they took that wooden tub and they put it under the steps that led to the second floor. And from time to time, as her mom passed by, if she saw a bit of the fish had come out of the solution, she would take that wooden paddle and push it down. And that whole chemically lye smell sort of drifted up into the room and mixed with the wood smoke there in the living room. But after a couple of days, the fish had started to relax. It actually started to plump up. It started to look like fish. So now it was time for phase 2. My mom's mom drained off that lye solution and replaced it with fresh water and allowed the fish to soak. And from time to time, she'd drain off that water, replace it with more fresh water. And so it was that she leached the lye out of that codfish. And all of this was planned so that the fish was ready to go 2 days before Christmas. Now, the rule in my mother's family's house was that the Christmas tree could not come in until the house was spotless. So my mother and her 3 siblings started to clean that house, and you have never seen 4 more motivated elves. It was like dust bunnies under the bed, gone. Dust on the window ledge, gone. Cobwebs, gone. At the end of the day, the house was spotless. So then Christmas Eve, in the morning, time to get the tree. So the kids all put on their hats and their scarves and their thick coats and their mittens and their boots. And my mom's mom came along too. And they stepped outside and they crunched into the forest to get the tree. Now, my mom's brother Bill, even though he was a little boy, he was the one carrying the hatchet because he was the man of the family. And they went to the tree that the kids had picked out in July, chopped it down, dragged it home, put it up in the living room, and then the decorations. They only had a couple of glass balls. They had some paper chains that the kids had made, but they had lots of those icicles, those long silver threads. They had been saved from the year before, probably saved from the year before, but there were plenty for the kids to drape all around that tree. And when they were done, the children felt as though this was the most beautiful tree in Michigan. Well, now the festivities for Christmas Eve were taking place at Grandma's house, at Grandma and Grandpa's farm, which was across the road and across this big field. So after it had gotten dark, it was time to head over. So the kids got all bundled up, and my mom's mom had to stay back, take care of something. But as the kids stepped outside, they saw above there was not a cloud in the sky. And it was like the stars were so bright, and there was the moon. And as they walked over to Grandma and Grandpa's house, they're crunching through that frozen field, and they're looking up, and they all agree that Joulebukkie, which is what they called Santa, Joulebukkie was going to have no problem whatsoever finding his way to their house that night. Well, at Grandma and Grandpa's house, the place was packed with relatives, and they had taken the couch and chairs, they'd pushed it aside in the living room, and they'd put up this tree. And my mom remembers this big tree, and on the end there were these little clips fastened that held real candles, and the candles were burning. And next to the tree there was this big overstuffed chair, and there sat Grandma. Now, my mother had never seen her grandmother sit down for what seemed like more than 2 seconds. But on this night, Grandma was sitting there, and everyone brought stuff to her all night long. She didn't have to lift a finger. Well, the aunties, they were all sitting in the couches and the chairs that had been pushed off to the side, and they were talking and laughing. And in the kitchen, there were the men. And they all had on their clean work shirts and their suspenders and their clean trousers. And they were sitting on benches that lined the kitchen, and they were all holding cups of coffee and talking about farming. And all the cousins, they were all sitting on the floor there in front of the Christmas tree, and they were playing with dolls, and they were playing with jacks, and there was a stove that was burning, and the heat of that stove and the heat of all those bodies, the whole house just felt overheated. But my mom sat down, she started playing with her cousins, and soon she saw the door quietly open and her mom come inside, and her mom went over and started talking with the aunties. Well, at some point in the evening, all of a sudden there was a commotion on the porch. There was this thumping, and the door flew open, and this man came in, and there was this ho ho, and the man had on this wool coat. It was like a sheep's wool on the outside, and he had on a red cap, and he had on this Santa Claus mask, like the Coca-Cola Santa, with the big pink cheeks and the mustache and the beard. And he stepped into the room and he's like, "Merry Christmas!" And he pulls out these little bags of candy. And he gives a little bag of candy to all the kids sitting on the floor, including my mom. And they are all looking, everybody gets an individual bag of candy. What a haul. And then this Santa, he goes over and he tickles the aunties and runs over and gives a peck to Grandma sitting in her chair. And then he just says, "Merry Christmas," and he's out the door. And my mom and her cousins are sitting there and they're looking at the candy and they're like, oh, Yola Bookie is real. Yeah. And they tuck into that candy like immediately. Well, then, as my mom's digging through her candy, she sees in a few minutes how the door opens and a man slips in. And he's this tall, slim man, and he's wearing one of those military jackets, with the leather on the outside and the sheep's wool on the inside. And she sees he has curly hair, blonde curly hair, and she recognizes him. It's her Uncle Reno. And she thinks she hasn't seen Uncle Reno for a while. And then she sees her mom run over and give Uncle Reno this big hug. And then, that phrase, I know Tobey often shares it about how little ones have big ears. Well, here's why. My mom is sitting there on the floor and the aunties are behind her on the couch. And the aunties all lean forward and start to talk. And it's through this that my mom learns that, yeah, Uncle Reno hasn't been around for almost 2 years. Because almost 2 years before, Uncle Reno had committed probably the worst sin imaginable. He had gone to a dance on Saturday night. Now, Grandpa, he was a fundamentalist Lutheran, and so to dance so close to Sunday was just something you did not do. And it was worse because Uncle Reno, he had taken Grandpa's truck and driven to the dance, obviously without permission. And when he was driving home, he went into the ditch and he ended up bunging up the front of that truck. And rather than facing the wrath of Grandpa, Uncle Reno just went down to the train tracks and he got on the first freight that came by and he just rode out of town. He didn't have any money. He didn't have a plan. No one had any idea where he went. Well, about a year passed and then this letter arrived. It was from Uncle Reno. And it was in that letter he told them how he had gone to California and he had joined the military. Well, knowing where he was, Grandma said, I want my boy home for Christmas. And somehow he got the leave. And so here he was. Well, my mom watched Uncle Reno as he moved around the room, and he had an ease about him. And he went up and he talked and he joked with the aunties, and he went over and he talked with Grandma. And he went into the kitchen, he shook the hands of the men that were there, and then he went over to the stove. He took a coffee mug, and there was this big pot of coffee on the stove, and he picked it up and he poured himself a cup of coffee. And as he was holding that cup of coffee and that coffee pot, Grandpa came over. And Grandpa came over and looked him right in the eye and then held out his mug. And Uncle Reno poured coffee into that mug. And when it was full, Grandpa looked at him, nodded, and then turned and went back in the kitchen. And Uncle Reno put that coffee pot back on the stove. And as he did that, he was smiling. And he had these beautiful white teeth. Well, at the end of festivities, my mother, her siblings, her mom, they got all bundled up and they walked across that frozen field, listening to the crunching. And when they got home, my mom and her siblings discovered that Yolabuki had been there. Oh, of course he had. But they would have to wait until the next morning before they could open their few presents and discovered that they were mostly pencils and paper for school and that kind of thing. But on Christmas Day, as my mother was setting the table, her mom told her to set one extra place. And as they got close to dinner, Uncle Reno came over. And it was time to cook the codfish. And so my mom's mom got this big silver pot and she filled it up with water and she put it on the stove. And then she took that codfish and she cut it into good-sized chunks. And she wrapped each one in a cheesecloth so it would stay together. And when the water on the stove was boiling, she dropped the codfish into that boiling water, boiled it for 10 minutes, and then it was done. And then she served that lutefisk meal as it should be served, that white fish with the white cream sauce, the white potatoes, the green peas, the whole thing swimming in butter. And as my mother and her siblings and her mom and Uncle Reno sat around the table, they were all talking and laughing and sharing stories. And Uncle Reno was sharing stories of his adventures. And my mom, what she remembered was looking at her mother. And her mother just had the biggest smile on her face and laughed with such ease and seemed so happy. And it was a look that my mother had not seen for a very long time. And after everybody had finished their plates, Uncle Reno declared that that lutefisk was the best lutefisk he had ever had. It was even better than Grandma's. And there was enough for everybody to have seconds. As I sat there, looking at my plate of lutefisk, if my mother had shared that story with me, I still wouldn't have eaten that plate of lutefisk. And finally, after I had been there for some time, my parents showed me mercy. And they said, if I would just eat 3 bites, I could be released from the table. And so I got those 3 bites down with some very generous gulps of water, and then I was released. And I think actually my mother felt a little guilty for serving lutefisk to my brothers and me, and she actually gave us prizes for simply trying the lutefisk. I remember I got this little cardboard space game. But in the years that have followed, there have been many, many times when I have been out driving and I've driven past one of those Sons of Norway halls, or maybe a Grange, or maybe one of those Finn halls. And I know my mother in her adulthood would go to those places seeking lutefisk solace. And there will be a sign there by the side of the road, a sandwich board. It's usually handmade, and it'll say something like, lutefisk, all you can eat, $10. And I look at the parking lot and it's absolutely packed. And I just keep driving. But I've got to say that I love the idea that back there at the Grange or the Norwegian Hall, that there are those outlaws eating that outlaw fish. Because there's something about lutefisk that is magical, sacred. The whole soaking of the fish, the smell of the lye, the transformation of the cod. To prepare lutefisk from start to finish is to be reminded that forgiveness is possible. Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of your storytelling tonight. But it's such a joy to be with you all. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I just will say that Ingrid's got a great Facebook page. Go to it because she talks about the radio program she's doing up in Homer and some of the other story events she's participating in with some other storytellers. And they're all very good. So, well, I think it's about time for us to open the doors and take a stretch out break outside for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll be opening with a round of story swap. And I think the first person up tonight is going to be Yael. So we'll give a whistle when this break's over.
Hi, everyone. Good evening to all of you. It's fabulous to see these beautiful faces. Miss you all. So I bring a story that I think I told here before, so you might recognize that story. It's my adaptation to The Ugly Duckling, with an adaptation that relates to these days. And the reason I bring it is that I'm starting a journey with that story, and I want to change that, picking the brains of all my storytelling folks. So I'm going from group to group till, I'll ask the questions and maybe people can help me transfer this story. So that's a beginning. Next month or the months after that, depends on if we're in Israel or not, I will bring maybe the new version. So we'll see how that goes. So when he was born, the midwife spat 3 times on the floor and said, "May the stars forgive us, a redhead." She looked at the mother. She tried to remember, she never saw anybody with a red head. Everybody had brown hair around her. She looked suspiciously now at the mother and gave her the baby. At the age of 5, he was sitting there watching the boys playing ball. He was going there every day afternoon. And oh, how he longed to be in the midst of the field and throw a ball and catch a ball and have fun. But he knew there was no use. They'll never let him in. But this afternoon, he could not contain himself. So he came closer and said, "Could I play ball with you?" All 5 kids about his age puffed their chest, crossed their arms, and said in unison, "Go away, you ugly, ugly redhead." When he was 9, his mom took him to the marketplace. She was smelling that ripe tomato, that first tomato of the season. And it had that sweet, sweet smell of the tomato with the smell of the earth. And it was so reddish. When she heard a commotion from the other side of the market, when she turned around, her heart sank. A plump merchant was shouting at her son, "Go away, you need to get out of here. You can't stay here. You're bringing us bad luck with your red hair." And the merchant next to her, a slim lady, started throwing eggs at him. The mother knew she had no other choice. She took her son by the hand and took him to the stream. And she said, "What is it that you see when you look into the water?" And he looked at her and said, "Well, I see my ugly red hair." And she said, "I was afraid that would be the case. I was hoping that by now you'll see yourself from my eyes, from your beautiful, beautiful, generous smile and loving heart. If you'll stay here, you'll die. You have to get out of here." And so she gathered some food for him and some water and gave him a hug only a mother who has to let go out of love can give, and send him on his way. He started going village to village, and he would go work for his keep, and they would give him food and shelter. But he would never stay at one place for long because these were nice people, and he couldn't curse them with his red hair. So he kept going from village to village. One afternoon, he was sitting by the river and looking. When he raised his eyes, he saw these beautiful trees of red and orange and yellow. Wait a minute, they look like my head. They look like heads. He was so mesmerized, he couldn't take his eyes off it. So he searched in his rucksack for something, and he found that paper, pencils, and paints that he could use, and started drawing these trees. And then he painted them. And now he would sit and paint every time he would stop in his way. And the snow started covering a blanket, white blanket was covering the soil now. So he sat there and painted the snow. And then he looked up. The winter brought a white sun. It wasn't yellow like the sun in the summer, so he painted that. And then he saw some people walking in the snow, and he added them. And these people were curious. They came to see what he was doing, and they were amazed how he could take a whole world and put it into a tiny piece of paper. So he gave them his painting, and they paid him for that. And he kept walking, and now the snow melted, and the birds were building their nest up in the trees. And he came upon a marketplace. And he looked, and the first thing he saw was that stand of flowers. And they were red and yellow and orange and purple. There was one that was dark crimson, almost black. So he sat and drew that. And then he saw the merchant that was selling the flowers, and he had a laugh, very deep belly laughter. So he painted his laughter. He painted the merchant and his laughter. And then he heard giggle, and he added that to his painting. And so he started coming to that market every day. And the kids in the village said, have you seen that red hair artist? Let's see what he's doing today. And they would grab a piece of paper and some pencil and pens, and they would run and sit next to him and start drawing. Well, one afternoon it was too crowded and noisy in the market. So he decided to change course, and he went to the stream. And by the stream sat a young woman. So he said to draw her. And her hands were so gentle with the fabric and the soap that she was using. And then when she lifted her turquoise eyes, he saw the kindness in her eyes, the love in her eyes. So he painted that. And then he went to her and gave her the painting. And so she started coming to the market every day to see what he was doing. For her, it was magic what he was doing with his hands, painting all these beautiful things he saw around. And she got a kick from these tiny kids that were all around him trying to do what he was doing. And in no time, they got to know each other. And so one day she took him by the hand to the stream. And she asked him, what is it that you see in the water when you look into the stream? And he said, well, I see your beautiful, beautiful face. She said, what else? Well, I see my red hair. I don't care for it that much. She said, look deeper. What is it that you see? And he said, well, I see a union. So they united their connection. And 39 weeks later, a baby girl was born with a red curly hair and very curious turquoise eyes. Oh, he painted her at her mother's breast. He painted her when she was crawling. He painted her first step. And then he painted her telling stories to her friends. And every night before she would go to sleep, they would sit together by her bed, and he will show her his paintings, and she would tell stories for his paintings. Truthful stories, loving stories, beautiful, beautiful, magical stories. Now he was sitting in front of a stage. His red hair was no longer red. His mother was sitting next to him. He was looking at the stage. On that stage was a beautiful young woman of 17 with the lashes, curly hair, and these beautiful turquoise eyes. His mother asked, what is it that you see when you look at that stage? And he looked at her and said, oh my goodness, I miss her mother so much. She looked so much like her mother. I wish her mother would be here to see how proud I am of that beautiful young woman. And she said, what else do you see? He said, well, every week they come, they cling to every word she tells. And then they go home and they repeat her stories to each other over and over again. I see a storyteller. She said, now look closer. What is it that you see? He said, well, I see the storyteller that told stories with her heart. And that's my story.
Thank you, Yael. What a wonderful story, right? storytellers and everything. So I think the next storyteller we're going to hear from is Billie. So come on up and here we go.
Do I have to crawl up and get in there?
There you do. Yeah. Yes. We keep looking. We'll get this adjusted for you.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Okay. Well, the first thing I thought of when Ingrid was telling was something that we've done in our family. My mom was the clean plate person too. And you know how you vow you're not going to make the same mistakes your parents do? You just make different ones. Well, one of the things that I did with my girls was the rule was you had to taste it if it was on your plate. But if you didn't like it, I took it away immediately and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were old enough to like that." I still have kids calling me and saying at age 60, "Mom, I'm old enough to like salmon now." So remember that if you have picky eaters. Our tastes do change. And the story that I want to tell tonight is something that it's a personal story. And it was my very best Christmas present this year. Some of you know that I have a bunch of kids and grandkids and great grandkids, and I have one little grandson, great grandson, who will be 13 this month. And he's been blind since he was 6. He had a brain tumor and surgery, and the surgery took his sight. He can do anything. He does woodworking, he does kayaking, he does rock climbing, he does amazing things. He's an amazing kid. And I have to go back 65 years to begin this story. 65 years ago, I was newly engaged to the man who would become my husband. My mother and father invited us to lunch in Lincoln City, Oregon, at a fancy hotel, the kind with beautiful white linen tablecloths and crystal, and I mean, it was lovely. My husband-to-be was the youngest child of Italian immigrants, and certainly not accustomed to that kind of dining. But he was on his best behavior. He had a new sport jacket on, and he was trying to just make a good impression. My mother had a habit that I was quite used to because she'd done it all of her life. She was always worried about eating too much. Not too much worried about drinking too much, but eating too much was a whole different thing. So one of the habits she had, she loved bread, especially hard rolls and crunchy kind of bread. And so when she'd get a hard roll, and as I said, I was accustomed to this because I'd always seen her doing this. She would break her bread in half, and then she would pull out the center, put the center back on the butter plate, and butter, put a ton of butter on the crispy outside and eat that. Well, here we were having this lovely lunch, and my mother takes her roll and she breaks it in half, pulls out the inside, and I see my husband giving her this look like, "What are you doing?" His mother made bread, like 15 loaves at a time, and it was the best bread you ever ate. However, he had never seen anybody do anything like that. And then all of a sudden, his body kind of tensed up, and I was sitting here and he was sitting here, and my mother was sitting next to him. And after that, he seemed really uncomfortable. We got out in the car and he said, "Your mother put her hand in my pocket." I said, "And?"
How Happy surprise?
Yeah, happy surprise. I said, was she just feeling around to see what was there, or did she leave something there? So he reached in his pocket and he pulled out what she had pulled out of the center of her roll, a bread ball. And he took it and kind of mashed it up. He said, look, this is what she did. She put this in my pocket. I said, give that to me. This was in September. So I saved that bread ball until Christmas. And then I wrapped it up in a little box, and in a bigger box, and in a bigger box, and a bigger box. Finally, a beautiful box that was like this big with a big bow on it. She was so excited to see what that was. She unwrapped and unwrapped and unwrapped. When she got to the original container, it was about this big with beautiful tissue paper in it, and she opened it up, and there was her bread ball. 65 years ago. That bread ball still lives in our family. It's about this big around, black, and hard as a rock, and it appears almost every Christmas. Sometimes it doesn't, because somebody's moved and they've lost it, but then they find it, and the next year, there it is again. So that's the basis or the background of this particular story. This great grandson that I have, who's amazing. Of course, all grandchildren and great-grandchildren are amazing, but he is particularly amazing. And so is his mother. She has started making sourdough bread. So she has her little starter and she makes her bread. And this Christmas, and I don't know, I've cried a few times telling this, maybe I can tell it without crying. But this year for Christmas, she got a little box all wrapped up with a beautiful ribbon. And in it was a new bread ball. And it was from her darling son, who had written in Braille and had someone print it for him. Mama, this is bread from your first loaf of sourdough bread. Oh, that's what it does for me. It's like to have that tradition, crazy as it is, carried on. It's like, I think I've lived long enough, to say, well, maybe Ingrid will get some lutefisk sometime wrapped up and she'll be old enough to eat it. So that's my story. Thank you.
I think Billie's had a much more interesting life than I have, because she always comes up with these great stories about family and things interesting that have happened to her. Mine's been rather dang boring. So anyway.
Come live with me for a while.
Yeah, that would be very exciting, sure. So Mitch is going to be our next story swap teller. So come on up, Mitch.
All right.
He's always the tail end guy, or leaves for his humor swaps. So
Sticking around today.
let's see what's happening tonight.
Tonight, I'm going to tell a short one.
I like your beard, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
It's coming in.
brothers.
Many years ago, there was a little kid that grew up in Idaho, and he had tiny little hands like mine. And he had a fourth grade teacher who was on playground duty that day. And he was just sitting in the dirt, playing, digging around, playing around. And she came out with one of those catalogs that teachers will get with all the different office supplies and things. And the kids were starting to gather around. And all of a sudden, she goes, "Oh my gosh, look at this one." And she showed all of the kids. And the little kid that was sitting there with tiny hands playing with the dirt was like, "Can I see? Can I see?" And she goes, "Oh no, I have a coffee. You're Mormon and you can't be around coffee." And she was just teasing me. But she wouldn't let me see. She wouldn't let me see. She wouldn't let me see. And finally, I got so mad, and I took a handful of that dirt and I chucked it. Well, the rest of the story is her story. I heard it from he wasn't even my teacher, but he was in the next school up in the middle school in 5th grade. And he pulled me off in the hallway one day, and he was like, "Do you remember Mrs. Willis?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you remember one day?" He said, "I came in into the teacher's lounge on a break one day, and there she was trying to clean up. And apparently, she had spent a half hour in the bathroom trying to get dirt out of her bra. And when she saw Mr. Gummersall, her phrase was, "I can't believe those little hands could hold so much dirt."
Well, most teachers, kids will come up and say, "Do you remember me? Do you remember me?" After teaching for so many years, I'm sure this teacher certainly remembered you. So anyway, Tobey, would you like to come up and tell a story, please?
Oh, Mitch, I gotta say, those catalogs, as a teacher, it was like Christmas. I could not believe, and the ones that I love, was one specially prizes, just for prizes. And you wouldn't buy like one little packet of alien erasers. I'm talking about 100 alien erasers at a discount price. Yeah, I love ordering time. Now, it's really interesting tonight because there are several stories that were told about judge and magistrates, and actually mine is about a judge. The story takes place in India many, many years ago. Long ago in India, the judges would go from village to village. There was not just one village in a village. So this judge went to this particular place. His name was Judge Subramaniam. Judge Subramaniam went into the inn where he was going to stay and preside. But the innkeeper was very, very agitated. "I can't believe it. There is a thief among us in this guest house of mine. This thief has stolen my daughter's gold ring. I will not rest well until I find the thief. It's somebody in this inn." And Subramaniam said, relax, relax. I'll take care of it. You don't worry. So Judge Subramaniam, he called all the guests together. Seems like we have a little bit of a dilemma here. There's a thief among us who has this gold ring. So what I am going to do is, and at this point he got into his pocket, I have some magic truth sticks. I'm going to give each one of you a stick. You will put it underneath your bed, and the next morning I will know who the thief is because these are magic sticks. The thief's stick will grow 1 inch in length. That's no problem. Give us the sticks. And so the judge passed them out. Everyone went upstairs to bed, and they put their stick underneath the bed. Now, the next morning, the guests came downstairs for breakfast of dosa and dal and yogurt. And the judge came down, and he started to look at all the guests. "Take out your sticks, please," which they did. And he looked around. "Jaya? No, not you. Rupa? No, not you. You, though, you are the thief." Everyone was shocked. "Judge, how do you know that person is the thief?" Show me your stick. All of you show me your sticks." And so they all showed They're sticks. I know he is the thief because... Why, Mitch? Why do you think?
Why did I think it's the opposite?
Why did he say, you are the thief? How did he know?
It was the shortest stick.
Oh my gosh. Judge Mitch, how wise you are. Because the judge says, I know you're the thief. Your stick is 1 inch shorter. These are not magic sticks. I knew that the thief would be so worried that they would actually cut off 1 inch of their stick. So you give back that ring. Oh, I'm so sorry, Judge. Yes, you are right. You are so wise. And he gave the ring back to the innkeeper. And Judge, what should his punishment be? Well, of course, he will stay with you. You won't show mercy. You won't teach him a good lesson. He will tend to all your needs in the inn. Clean, make the beds, do the cooking. And so this Judge Subramaniam, so wise as he packed up his bag and he went to the next village. Thank you.
I know, I've heard too many of those ones. I got me thinking.
Yeah, got to be fast around here. Thank you, Tobey. So I think in the middle of the winter, we often wonder, what are we going to do? So on New Year's Day, we had sort of a special day. Bret and Tobey and Lynn and I were able to take part in one of the state park's first day hikes, which occurred this year at Lake Sylvia State Park. So we went there, and some of the big hikers got out and really did the big hike, but some of us were smarter, went on more of a stroll. And I think our stroll was only about 100 yards, but it was led by somebody. So I'm thinking about Billie talking about grandkids carrying on all these traditions. I'm thinking often I've met people who don't have kids, they don't have nieces or nephews or anything else. So who continues these stories on? So I'd like to talk about a couple of people I've run into during my years in the state parks. And one of them was the lady who led us on the stroll, who was Helen Hepp, one of our people who's in our friends group in Montesano. Helen has taught so many kids in Montesano. Whenever we've done anything, she's been a great part of our organization, because when we need somebody, Helen brings them into the group, and we get a lot of help that way. So Helen led us on this stroll. Now, I grew up in a state park, and I thought I knew all the plants and everything, but Helen took us on this little stroll of 100 yards or so. And it was amazing. As we went along, she's pointing out things that I'd seen and didn't even realize about these things. Like, well, I'd think, well, look at that elkhorn moss. Well, that's not a moss, that's a plant. And so she would tell us all about that. Or some other little thing about this big that went beyond my sight, but she's picking it out and showing us the things that are growing on the forest floor. So I think I just wanted to talk about Helen Hepp, because I thought, it's important to remember these people as we go on, as we all age. So probably the first person like that I ever saw in the state park was about 65 years ago, when I was just a kid, and I lived at Schaefer State Park. So in those days, the park ranger and his family were sort of it for all of the public relations. We didn't have rangers with guns. We didn't have interpretive specialists like we do now. We didn't have maintenance people or anything. The family sort of did everything. And so we knew a lot of the people that came to the campsite. And one of them was a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bacon, lived up on the Puget Sound here up at Arletta. And they had one of those little teardrop trailers. I was fascinated. The back would pop up, and there was a stove they would pump up and cook their stuff on. They were so nice. They would actually take me back to their home for a week or two for a vacation when I was little. And another person were Mr. and Mrs. Herbert from Seattle. Mr. Herbert was an immigrant from England. He had about 6 months of formal education. He drove a taxi cab in Seattle, and while the other fellows were all reading the racing forums and everything, Mr. Herbert was teaching himself by reading encyclopedias, the dictionary from cover to cover, plant books, everything else. So he would take a lot of us kids in the park on little walks through the park and explain to us how dandelions had come to be spread across America. And the French name Dante de Lion, the mane of the lion, was the way the dandelion came about. And with different types of fir trees we had and everything. He also liked my donkey. Now, I've told you about my donkey, Pedro, right? So Pedro was such a fine donkey. I wish I'd brought it. Mr. Herbert wrote a poem on a big sheet of paper in perfect handwriting, was an ode to a jackass. And so the poem talked about Pedro's bray ringing up and down the valley and everything. So I've still got that pinned to my office wall. But he told us about all these plants and everything. And I thought, this man is really something. And I'd read a few books, so I said, you're pretty dapper and debonair, you know. And Mr. Herbert really liked that. So I've still got 2 forestry books, volume 1 and 2 of primers of forestry. One's from dapper and one's from debonair. But so I think about Mr. Herbert, who had no children, and he just disappeared one time, and we never found out what happened to him. But his name was John Aloysius Pope Fitzherbert. So I try to remember John Aloysius Pope Fitzherbert. And I'm hoping the kids and everything go on these trips that Helen is so good about doing at the park. We'll remember Helen Hepp. Thank you. Do we have any more stories? Anybody online up there? Anybody in the group tonight with an extra story? Bret. Oh, I see Bret raising his hand here. So how about a fool story, Bret?
That's okay. Well, this is a short one. It's about Mullah Nasruddin. Mullah Nasruddin, you know, he was a working man, and one day after work, he was walking home and he decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. And as he was going through, he noticed a funeral, and the people were sad, and they were all gathered around saying nice things. And he approached one man and he said, what's going on? He said, oh, this is a very sad time. We are burying a politician, an honest man. And Nasruddin nodded his head and said, I didn't realize they had to bury 2 people in one grave. So, and now is a short time for a commercial. Mitch, our internet wizard, has agreed to take tonight's recording, and he will put it in YouTube format, and he'll put the site on our website. So if you go to our website, and it'll be there that you can be able to hear all of these great stories through the YouTube channel. So thank you, Mitch.
We start with calibration this year.
I
got recorded, and then December I didn't get the link again. So
Stories weren't that good in December, so we skipped it, I think.
okay. Just true. But we'll get them. Yeah, I'll try to catch us up.
Okay. Anybody else?
Oh,
Come on. Here's Sandra.
Yeah.
We've got time. We got lots of time. And then we'll give one more commercial before we end.
This is only because of the bread ball and the lutefisk. I'm from the Swedish branch of lutefisk and the Clean Plate Society. And the rule in our house was to eat everything that had been put on your plate as well. Now, you could make that a very small serving, but if it was on your plate, you had to eat it. Well, that was a problem at Christmas time when Katrin Holda, my mother's eldest sister, would prepare the whole Swedish smorgasbord with head cheese and lutefisk and all these other things in aspic that jiggled. I was only interested in the desserts, but I had to put at least a spoonful of everything on the plate first. And there were copious amounts of water that were drunk during that meal. But then during the rest of the year, it would be whatever my mother had prepared. And she was a very good cook, mostly, except when she decided to make lima beans. Now, I don't know what it was about lima beans other than they were mushy. And I just didn't like them. But I had to sit there at the table until I'd eaten my lima beans. And it was really not that large of an amount, but I wasn't having it. So I sat there soaking, and the rest of the family left the table, and the dishes were done, and people went off to do other things, and I sat there. And I sat there, and eventually the lights began to get turned out in every place around the house except over the kitchen table and the sulking Sandra. And then finally, when I figured they were all gone to bed, I took that lima bean and I squished it and I smashed it up under the table. And then I thought, that was really smart. And I went off to bed saying, the plate's clean. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about at what point, because I knew such concepts as evaporation, at what point does it lose its moisture and stop adhering to the bottom of that table? So eventually I went back into the kitchen on tiptoes, scooped up that little wad of lima bean paste, shaped it into a ball, and put it in my brother's baseball net. You can do other things with little balls and brothers.
Okay, very good. So next month, I think, we often have stories, themes around love or bad experiences or something. I think we could probably all go around here and have just a story swap of nothing but foods we were forced to eat, right? So maybe we'll do that some month. Anyway, one more.
Codfish balls.
Pardon me?
Codfish balls.
Mm,
My mother made those, and I swear to God, the more you chewed them, the bigger they got.
Yep. Boiled onions, a few other things. So I think next month we're going to meet on February 8th, which is the second Wednesday of the month. It'll be another great month. And I just might say, Mitch has got our Story Guild up on the website, southsoundstory.org, not South Sound Story Guild, southsoundstory.org. And there is a donation link on there. You can link in and you could donate, or you can also, if you're not a member yet, join, and you'll get these wonderful newsletters from Tobey as to what we're doing and little preview of the featured and opening tellers. So tonight, Barbara, thank you for your opening stories about the little elves in Iceland. And Ingrid, thank you about your stories about the small people also, which was a continuing theme, which was very good. And we're always pleased to hear from both of you. And they were wonderful stories. So does anybody have anything to add before we quit?
I do. Rebecca.
Okay.
Whoop, Rebecca. Hey, Ingrid, unmute and tell people about Storyworks, please, for January, would you?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Story People of Clallam County team with South Sound Story Guild to bring Storywork, which is the third Monday of every month, and it goes from 7 to 9 Pacific time. It is an opportunity for people to just come together and work on stories. And we send out a missive about a week before, which has the Zoom link. And I do believe that Maggie has forwarded it to all the members of the guild there. But you just show up. If you want to work on a story in any way, shape, or form, from just initially like, this is an idea I have, to running through a story, you as the teller direct the story listeners of what you would like to get from them, which can be anything from comment on everything to, I just want to say this out loud and I don't want any comments at all. And also every storyteller needs story listeners. So if you just want to come and listen to people working on stories, there's much to be gained to hear people coming through that process. Yeah. So it's coming up the third Monday of the month, and yeah, it'll be great.
Okay.
Thank you,
All right,
Ingrid, for sharing that. Oh, Ann Penfound? Huh, I can't hear you, Ann.
That's because my microphone was muted. There's a Crone weekend coming up. You may have been told about it by Seattle Storytelling Guild. Your lovely Rebecca, who's looking at me from my screen, and Pam Mabin, and I'm going to take part too. It's in honor of Alison Cox. She was the sort of idea behind it, and then Jen Stone, who I think a lot of you know from Fanning the Embers, she took over the organization with Seattle Storytelling Guild. And I just wanted to let you know, because some of you may have known Alison and may want to just listen in or say your little piece about Alison. It's I think it's sort of going to be pretty open as far as that sort of thing is concerned. But anyway, just to let you know.
And also that will be recorded. So if you can't make it to, it's a 2-day event on Saturday and Sunday. And if you can't make it at that time, it will be recorded and available for 2 weeks afterwards. So you can check into it then. So